I see we are live and on the air. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Vermont State Senate Committee on Institutions. Today is the 7th day of April, 2021. I am the chair of the committee and your host for this afternoon's events, Joe Benning from Caledonia County. We also have Senators Mazza from Grand Isle, Ingalls from Essex Orleans, Senator McCormick from Windsor, and I see Senator Parent's name is there. He's from Franklin County. I am going to just pause for a moment and say we are live on YouTube, and I give this explanation for every meeting. We have no idea who is going to be watching from the outside world. So in that regard, I try to make sure everybody starts from scratch as to who they are, how they fit into the picture we are going to be talking about. And basically, if you are using vernacular that I think will be above what the average first-time citizen tuning into a Senate committee would know about, I may pause you and ask you to explain what that happens to be. We are here for the purpose of the discussion today to talk about a proposal that has somehow surfaced in the Capitol bill. And the proposal initially we heard about, I think about a year ago, was to sink the ferry boat Adirondack in Lake Champlain to be used for a diving target, if you will. And that proposal went before our counterparts in the House, and the House Committee on Corrections and Institutions decided to put language into the Capitol bill which specifically prohibited that. For the witnesses who are here today, I'm just raising this concern of ours, if you will. Normally, our committee does not get involved in conversations that have to do with environmental actions of whatever kind. It is apparently part of our conversation only because of what's called the public trust doctrine. And again, for the purposes of those who may be tuning into YouTube, the public trust doctrine requires the state to hold in trust, if you will, certain properties and items that may be in the interest of the state. I am not quite sure how this discussion came about in the House Corrections and Institutions Committee, but it did, and it is now embodied in the Capitol bill, and our committee has to decide what to do with that provision. We're not making any calls. I know various of us have different opinion on what might be going down there, but basically today we're here to learn from scratch how this conversation began and what the end result was and who's happy with it, who's not happy with it. With that, I have, by way of priority on my list, my schedule, and this is not necessarily the order we have to go in, but Laura Treichman from the Historic Preservation Office, I have you first on the list. Did you want to lead off the conversation, or would you prefer somebody else do that?
I can lead it off. Yes.
Okay, so Laura, the floor is all yours, or as I should say, the poop deck is all yours. How's that?
Great, thank you.
And by the way, for you witnesses who've never been here before, subtle humor and funny little things are always welcome, and we take them in stride.
We try.
So Laura, welcome.
Thank you. I am Laura Treichman, the Vermont State Historic Preservation Officer. The Lake Champlain Underwater Historic Preserves is a program under my direction within the Division for Historic Preservation. We are part of the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. This program was established in 1982 to provide safe and guided access to some of the lake's historic shipwrecks. Our office supervises the program with the direct involvement and aid of the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, the U.S. Coast Guard, the state of New York, and a team of dedicated professionals who volunteer their expertise and time. Essential to the success of the program is the public partnership with registered divers assisting in the monitoring of the preserves. The popularity of the preserves is growing rapidly as outdoor recreation activities increase and social media exposes the public to the lake and its programs. The experiences offered great thanks to the Maritime Museum, enable diving or remote operated vehicles for non-divers, and now also through digital experiences like videos and 3D modeling. As you know, Lake Champlain is one of the top destinations in Vermont and for our visitors, generating some 700 million in revenue through property values, state parks, fishing, tourism. Preservation of this asset is really very important, as a healthy lake will continue to stimulate the economy, attract tourism, and provide a beautiful backdrop to the Green Mountains. The proposal to add to the underwater preserves is intended to augment the history and recreational activities of the lake, and most certainly would be done in a manner that meets and exceeds the standards of the Environmental Protection Agency, DEC, Army Corps of Engineers, and any other entity we need to work with. The proposal to sink the Adirondack Ferry is a rare opportunity to add a resource to the preserves that has been on the lake for 67 years and is actually currently still on the lake, sitting at Perkins Piers awaiting news of her future. Despite the limited ability to track the numbers, enjoying the history and recreational activities, we have documented an increase in visitation to the wrecks by divers and through the adventures of the Maritime Museum. Underwater archaeologists, divers, history buffs have for years requested an expansion of the sites open for exploration. Although there are probably 100-some wrecks on the Vermont side of the lake, just 9 of those have been opened through the underwater preserves. We do have one site open on the New York side because they do not have such a program. The limited number of open sites is in part due to the funding of the program, but also in great part due to the vulnerability of the wrecks and how that marries with the safety of the public. Some wrecks are hundreds of years old, and although well preserved in the fresh waters of our lake, they are fragile wooden structures. For example, it's dangerous for divers, even trained professionals, to go below deck on the General Butler or the tugboat La Valley. And newly discovered parts of the steamboat Phoenix, or our great friend the Spitfire that belonged to Benedict Arnold, are too deep to safely explore. Of the known wrecks on Lake Champlain, about 60% were intentionally scuttled, reefed, or abandoned. One example open in the underwater preserves is the La Valley, which was intentionally reefed in 1931. So now, with efforts to clean our waterways, intentionally reefing is not as commonly practiced as it was historically, but it is still done. I'm very familiar with 2 examples on Lake Michigan. One was done in 2003 and another in 2010. In 2003, they sunk a 1928 car and passenger ferry deliberately 75 feet down in Lake Michigan in the Chicago area to create an underwater destination for divers and an artificial reef. The 200-foot-long Mackinac Ferry is one of the largest complete structures submerged in their lake, and it's just sitting 10 miles northeast of Navy Pier. Reasons for sinking vessels like the Mackinac and the Adirondack include creating artificial reefs to protect shorelines and make habitats for fish, while also preserving the historic vessels in a manner allowing perpetual exploration in the right context, which is very much the case here, and making a place for diver awareness and training of all skill levels. In the case of the Adirondack, the vessel would create an artificial reef that fish most certainly would love to explore, but more importantly, it would provide an opportunity to document the artificial reefing of a steel-hulled vessel in fresh water. All our other wrecks are wooden vessels. This would also provide an opportunity to monitor the attraction of steel-hulled vessels to the mussels and other species now taking up lodging in our lakes. Not every historic vessel that floats on Lake Champlain should be preserved, celebrated, or provided a second life like this. The Adirondack meets the criteria for inclusion in the underwater preserves because it has a history of 67 years on the lake. It tells a story none of the other wrecks can. It has significance, making it eligible for the National Register. It will increase public awareness of the preserve system, and it will enable exploration for divers within itself, within its decks, something the fragile wooden wrecks can't. Moreover, the Adirondack would enable diver training on a real wreck, which is also limited on the wooden wrecks. And this is a significant safety feature that ADI can offer us. Preservation of vessels on dry land removes it from the context of Lake Champlain and actually would be more costly than reefing it. The Ticonderoga at Shelburne Museum has been renovated twice since coming on land in 1954 because it's continuously deteriorating, and actually has a $1.7 million endowment to ensure its perpetual care and ongoing required maintenance. It's a costly endeavor, and the Ticonderoga should be a unique example and not the model. Bringing it on land is a process most likely prohibitive today financially and environmentally. Similarly, the reefing of the Adirondack should be a unique example. We conducted public outreach. We did a survey, which is still in operation on our website. 86% of those who took the online survey support the proposal. At a public meeting last year, the audience was polled with overwhelming support, but we want to welcome the opportunity to have additional public meetings and educational sessions as this proposal moves forward. The Adirondack is being prepared for its next adventure with a thorough cleaning to ensure there are no toxic materials remaining that shall harm the lake, its inhabitants, or the public. The preparation follows the guidelines and requirements of the EPA National Guidance for Best Management Practices for Preparing Vessels Intended to Create Artificial Reefs. This includes hazardous waste mitigation, preparing flooding access and air egress holes, ballasting, and anchoring. The hazardous materials to be addressed are the oil and fuel, asbestos, PCBs, paint, solid debris, and any other materials of environmental concerns. The extensive process would need to take place whether the vessel was to be reefed or scrapped. And scrapping would be a waste of our history. We take the cleanup very seriously. I have been working with DEC, the Army Corps of Engineers, the owners of the ADI who proposed this idea to us several years ago, the Harbor Master of Burlington, the EPA, and others to ensure the vessel is ready, clean, and safe to become a new recreational asset for visitors to Lake Champlain. The experts are certifying the Adirondack is ready. This is not something that we are doing on our own. We are relying on the permitting process and the experts to tell us. I want to be really clear and explain that although the remediation of the hazardous materials and the actual reefing are not being done using state dollars, the addition of the Adirondack through the underwater preserves is included in the capital bill because funding for the underwater preserves is a line item to the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. Adding the Adirondack would put pressure on our capital construction budget funding. As part of the underwater preserves, it will need underwater signage, buoys, marketing. And as you know, we have limited funding with an increasing popularity of this program. Even without adding the ferry, we need to work with our partners, particularly the Maritime Museum, to assess the marketing and outreach programs, the regular cost of and activities related to Coast Guard permitting, and protection elements like signage and buoys to ensure we give this program and its users the respect it deserves and the safety it requires. So because we have this line item in the capital bill related to the underwater preserves, that's why the proposal for the Adirondack has been attached to this. When we added the La Valley, I think was the last one, we came to the legislature and put before you the proposal to increase the number of underwater preserves, specifying how that was going to be paid for and how we were going to continue to maintain the overall program with this addition. And respectfully, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to both House and Senate institutions to make sure we're opening up the right recs for the diving public and for the community. Because it's not just the divers that benefit from these recs. I'm sure Susan McClure will talk better about this, but the activities we have related to the diving sites, the 3D modeling, the research, the investigations. There's even really great videos and 3D modeling for those of us that stay on the land. But we really want to make sure that this is the right opportunity for us. And I do think it is a rare opportunity. Thank you.
Lauren, to those who would suggest this might be precedent for using the lake bed as a junkyard, what would your response to that be?
So first of all, we've established criteria which the Adirondack meets for some intentionally reefing something to become part of the underwater preserves. Once anything hits the bottom of the lake, it becomes the responsibility of the state of Vermont. And that is one reason that we participated in the permitting process to make sure that not everything gets thrown into the lake.
Okay.
We do not want this to be opening the door and opportunity for other resources. We've even already been asked the question. I think there was a sailing boat from the 70s, and we gave that a quick hard no.
Okay. Committee questions? Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I had used the term junkyard at one point, and I was not so much worried about a precedent as that it struck me that we would already be there. That this sinking this is using the lake as a junkyard. But I do want to ask, how many wrecks are there at the bottom of the lake now?
I would put that more to Susan McClure from the Maritime Museum. I report on 100 each year on the Vermont side.
100? Okay. Now, how many of those are presently being managed for diving?
Just 9 on the Vermont side.
Yeah. So whatever it costs to do this to the Adirondack, how many of those historic wrecks could we manage for the same money?
I'm not sure I follow your question. Sorry.
We're going
Because
to, go ahead.
I was going to say, because we're not paying for the sinking and all of that, I know that's up in the several hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
But
you'll be managing it once it's down there.
Exactly. Yes. We estimate each wreck is about $5,000 to set up and manage and market. And that's why I feel like we need to take a step back and look at the entire program and how we're doing this. The Adirondack is much larger, so it would require 2 buoys and more signage. So it could probably cost us as setup about $8,000 once we buy the buoys.
Although otherwise the state does not bear any of the other expense.
That's correct.
You did get in the capital bill as sent over to us from the House an additional 10,000 from your normal allotment.
It's my understanding.
It's from the governor's initial recommend. You got an additional 10,000.
One-time money to open up other sites.
Okay.
That would still require us to rethink how we go forward with approximately 13 sites with the same amount of money.
Okay. Senator Mazza.
What role did the Lake Champlain Ferry Company play? Did they get it ready for the dive? What did they sponsor outside? I mean, giving it to you or giving it to the the folks that are going to manage it. But did they play a role in getting it ready for environmental concerns?
Absolutely. They're taking on all of that responsibility. And in fact, they still own it. They wanted the state to take ownership before it was sunk. And we said no. So once it hits the bottom, once she stops moving, then the state will take ownership. But right now, the transit company is footing the bill for the remediation and the storage right now, and will be covering the cost of sinking it.
And getting all the materials off, all getting it ready, the paint and everything. So
Yes, absolutely.
that's
Yes.
going to be quite expensive for them, I think, right? It's going to be quite a lot of
Yes.
money. Yeah. Okay.
Other questions for Laura? Seeing no other hands, I'm going to move to Susan McClure of Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. And your first question is, does Eric Tichner still work for you?
Hello. No, Eric Tichner does not still work at Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. Interestingly, he has bought a wooden boat and is running charter sailing trips off of the North Shore of Long Island.
Good for him.
Yeah.
That was my only real connection to him. So with that, if you could introduce yourself and tell us how you fit into the picture.
Great. Thank you all for having me today. I'm Susan Evans McClure. I'm the executive director at Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. And as Laura Trieshman mentioned, we manage Vermont's underwater historic preserves on behalf of Vermont's Division for Historic Preservation. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the preserve system and what we do, and then happy to take any questions. We'll also kind of explain how if the Adirondack joins the preserve system, how that will work as part of the overall project. So currently, as Laura mentioned, there are 9 preserves on the Vermont side of Lake Champlain. They're all fascinating in their own way, but I will save you the historic fun facts and details on them today. But every year the museum maintains the preserves. So our team does regular dives on the sites to check for damage or safety hazards. We install and deinstall the buoys seasonally. The buoys allow boats to tie up safely and access the wrecks. We maintain a database of diver registrations, and we update the preserve's website with new information and videos of the site each year. Generally, the museum is really the central spot for information and safety for divers looking to access these sites. And we also provide education and access to the important stories of our shared history that these shipwrecks can tell us through talks, programs, and events. As Laura mentioned, we've also started doing some 3D modeling of the shipwrecks to really examine them in more detail and create that experience of diving for the non-divers among us. This was a pretty exciting year for the preserve system with the discoveries of the paddle wheels from the steamboat Phoenix, which garnered national and international media attention for both the preserve system and for Vermont history. The preserve system draws divers to Vermont from around the country who come to the area in non-COVID years, and hopefully will be back again soon, to spend their tourism dollars in our local economy. And most importantly to us, the preserve system preserves our shared history in a way that focuses on sharing it with the public and hopefully inspires people to make connections between the history of our region and their own lives today, which will instill a sense of stewardship for the lake and the shipwrecks for the future. So around 600 divers access the preserves each year, but a much higher number engage with the wrecks online and through programming. In 2020, we had about 14,000 visitors to our online virtual shipwreck tours. And then we had about 3,000 youth and adults learn about the preserve system through in-person or virtual education programs. And when it comes to the proposed sinking of the Adirondack and adding it to the preserve system, the Maritime Museum really sees our role as being a contractor who works on behalf of the state and as a nonprofit that is advocating for the process. We talk a lot about rules around historic preservation and specifically submerged cultural resources, which is, I think Laura and I both use that, the fancy term for shipwrecks. And this is another example where there are rules that guide both historic preservation and protection of public waters and lands. And the museum, we are contractors to work on behalf of the state. And if the decision is made to add the Adirondack to the preserve system, we would happily manage it and steward the resource. Laura mentioned a little bit about scuttling. About 60% of the wrecks in Lake Champlain were intentionally scuttled. Scuttled is the practice of I'm trying to channel Senator Benning's reminder to not use too many jargony words. So scuttling is when you sink something on purpose to dispose of it. And it was a pretty common practice through the 20th century. The practice did end in the it was a common practice up to the middle of the 20th century. And then the practice did end in the middle of the 20th century. As the public gained a greater awareness about clean water issues and regulations were put in place to prevent it. Modern reefing is also something that has been done around the country and around the world, and the EPA does have a process for it. I am not a scientist, I'm a public historian, so that is outside of my jurisdiction, but there is a lot of work and research that has been done from the scientific community on that. Having the Adirondack in the preserve system really presents the same public good as having any boat in the historic preserve system, and we are all about more preserves. So having the Adirondack join would increase historic preservation. Lake Champlain is really a great place to keep old boats in one piece. Cold, dark water is really the best we can do for preservation, and we have plenty of cold, dark water. It will also create an artificial reef that will increase fish habitat and can be used as a testing site for invasive species, if that is something that is deemed of importance by the scientific community. And most importantly for us, it's really about diver awareness and promotion of the diving opportunities in Lake Champlain. And over the years, we have considered adding several new recs to the underwater historic preserve system. As Senator McCormick asked, there are other boats that are ones that we have considered and ones that we've done research on adding. As Laura mentioned, all of those new additions do take funding, and it costs about $5,000 to put a boat into the system, and then it costs money every year to maintain them. We're currently managing 9 boats in the system at around $25,000 a year. And every time we need to, buoys need to be replaced every few years. And the museum, the great thing about the Underwater Historic Preserves, it's a really great public, nonprofit, private partnership. So the museum is also putting resources towards this that we are fundraising for separately to support a lot of this work because we care about it and we want to be a good partner to the state. And the state resources are allowing us to do that work as well. However, there's always more we can do, and we are, as we add more boats to the preserve, it would be of great help to have more funding to allow us to do that work. But there are some other boats that we are considering, and I'd be happy to talk about those. And I know we're limited for time, so I don't want to talk. I mean, I could talk about old boats all day, but I don't know if you all want me to talk about old boats all day. So I'm happy to talk about some of those other sites we're considering, or wrap up. What would I'll put that to the chair to see what I should do.
Well, you're not any relation to the McClure ship that's out there right now.
I am not. No, the Lois McClure is a wonderful person and very generous, and we just happen to share a really great last name. But I'm not related to her.
Okay. I left you hanging with my connection with Eric. I'm actually a motorcycle rider as one of my hobbies, and I was a charter member of the Harley Davidson ownership group out of Barrie. And about 20 years ago, they named me chapter historian, and they didn't have any idea what that meant in doing that. So they were carted around the state for years to various historic sites, and one of them was the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. About 30 of us descended on poor Eric, and he had to lead us all through the museum and tell us all about the place. That's my connection.
Well,
Committee.
I hope that, sorry, I'll just say that I hope that you'll all come back. I hope you'll all come back to the museum this year. We're reopening in the end of May. We will not be charging admission this year as a way to give back to the community and welcome folks back after we've gotten through this year that we've been through. So hopefully we welcome all committee members and motorcycle riders for guided tours.
Well, that's good news about not charging any admission, because the last time I was there, it cost me a whole bunch of money out of my pocket to get that group to go through the museum, as I recall. But thank you for that. Committee, any questions? Senator Mazza.
I think we all know Art Cohen, and I've had some conversation with him about this. He's a big supporter of this project, and Art has been affiliated with the lake for many years, and he thinks this is a real good project. And I might add, Mr. Chair, that my store has been here 67 years. And I didn't know if I could put my name on the boat or something if we sink it or something like that. Is that a possibility, yeah.
Well, I would at least get a sign hooked up to a buoy as they're going down. They can see this buoy brought to you by,
Dick Maz's store.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it had to be started in 1954. Is that correct? Is that the date the boat started?
sounds about right.
Okay. Was it a new boat at that time?
It was not. Actually, it came to Lake Champlain. It came to Lake Champlain, I think, from California. Am I remembering that right? Laura or Lauren might know that. But did not start its life in Lake Champlain, but it will be ending its career here.
Thank you.
It is the oldest continuously operated double-ended car ferry in the United States, which is a
Wow.
very specific point of fact. But I don't know how much competition it has in that designation. But
When you sink it down that many feet, does it rust or anything, or no? It just stays natural, or does it coat with stuff on it, or how does the metal accept the lake?
yeah, that's a great question about reefing specifically. A lot of the saltwater reefs, the reefing that's done in saltwater, the steel does disintegrate more quickly in saltwater. It will rust over time. Here, it'll take a lot longer. And what will grow on it is an interesting question. I think it's, and maybe one that Lauren will be able to answer in her testimony a little bit more. But it will be something that will be interesting to monitor as we move forward.
People, the divers can go into the boat. Is that how they do it? They go into the ship or the ferry. They can enter it, or?
Yeah, so this ferry will, because it's so big, the intent is to have different levels accessible for different levels of diving expertise.
Okay.
And there are different shipwrecks that, as Laura mentioned, you cannot go inside. And that's something, as we are looking at adding, which we are very happy to do, add more preserve sites from existing boats. As we're looking into that, we do have to do some preservation and structural assessment work on those boats to make sure they are safe, and that diving on them and accessing them isn't going to cause damage in any way to the boats or to the people. Of course, people, being the priority, but also we want to keep the boats intact.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm not sure who I'm asking. It might be for this witness, but someone else might have an answer. What do we know about the divers? What their motivations are? It would seem to me, I mean, I like to visit historical sites. I don't know if I would be interested in visiting an historical site that was put there for the purpose of having people visit it. Most historical sites are historical sites because of something that happened there that has nothing to do with people going to visit it. I'm wondering if Senator Benning would take his metal detector out and be thrilled to find metal objects that have been planted there for the purpose of being found by hobbyists with metal detectors. What do we know about why people dive at these sites?
I'm happy to take a stab at that one.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the divers, we have had a long-term relationship. The museum has had a long-term relationship with the dive community. The museum was founded by divers, as Senator Mazza mentioned. Art Cohn, who of course is a diver and founded the museum. Hearing from the divers, what they really want is more access to underwater sites in Lake Champlain. And they've wanted more sites for a while and have been requesting them for a while. One interesting thing I heard at the public meeting that really stuck with me was that the dive community feels that they used to have more easy access to the lake, and over time, as more shoreline has become private property and they've had less access to the lake, it's just harder to get out there. It's harder to go diving in Lake Champlain. So they're interested in more state-supported sites where they can access underwater resources. I don't know personally how, I think that the interest of something new is the excitement. I, not being a diver, and I haven't posed this question to them specifically, but I'm not sure how much it's the uniqueness of it versus the historic nature of it. I think that what I have heard and understood is that the more new opportunities are good, that the divers who dive here, they do tend to come back every year. Some of them are local. It's great to see. I mean, I think you have to be really into it to go every year and want to see how it changes year to year. You want to see new things. So opening access to new opportunities of all kinds would be very welcome from the dive community.
So the diving is more, the interest is more in the diving itself rather than in the interest of the site. It's just diving is the motive.
I hope it's both. I would think it's both.
Mm.
I do think that it's probably different for each person, right? It's kind of like the historic sites. It's, we visit a historic site on land. I mean, I am the kind of person who will go to a historic site because of the importance of the historic story. Some other people might go because it's nice and it's outside and they want to have a picnic with their family. And the same holds true for underwater historic sites. I think some people are motivated by the history, some are motivated by just being in the lake.
Okay.
A little difficult having a picnic on a sunken boat, but that's
Yeah.
another story.
Well, Mr. Chairman, maybe we should contact the Disney Corporation and they could set up Diver World and just set up various facilities to explore.
Interesting you brought up metal detecting, because Laura and I are involved in another conversation. The difference between detecting on land and detecting on water pursuant to the law is quite striking. And the way I read the law, there are more proscriptions on what you can take off of the land than there are from underwater. So we're taking a closer look at that legislation and the current statutes, and probably we'll have a discussion in this committee likely next year about that whole subject. Any other questions for Susan? Susan, thank you very much. Lauren, I have you up next. I'm looking at the time, it's 2:05. I personally have to leave at 2:30. I don't know whether we'll finish before then or not, but we're going to take it as it comes. And Misha, if you're still waiting to be in the loop, is it possible for you to come back tomorrow?
Yes, I could be available tomorrow as well.
Okay, let's see how we do. Lauren, welcome to Institutions.
Thank you, Chairman Benning. And my testimony is about 5 minutes long and maybe a little bit longer to answer some other, or to add clarification to some of the other points that were raised. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lauren Sofer. I'm the Director of Science and Water Programs at the Lake Champlain Committee, LCC. We are a bi-state nonprofit that has been dedicated to protecting lake health and accessibility since 1963. Thank you, Chair Benning, Vice Chair McCormick, and members of the committee for the opportunity to provide testimony today. We really appreciate it. To give you a sense of who I am, I grew up in the Lake Champlain Basin. My drinking water source was Lake Champlain, and I learned how to swim in its waters. My family is full of anglers and divers, including my dad, who has explored many of the underwater historic preserve UHP sites. LCC is a longtime supporter of the UHP, and we believe it adds historic and recreational value to Lake Champlain. However, we have concerns about the sinking of the MV, which stands for Motor Vessel Ferry Adirondack, which I'll now outline. So I'll cover 4 topics: precedent, public trust, long-term monitoring, and water quality. Precedent. The 1970 sinking of a barge to create a breakwater in South Hero and its subsequent removal in 2019 has been referenced as a precedent to justify sinking the MV Ferry Adirondack. That vessel was sunk 50 years ago when the practice was common and before the Federal Water Pollution Act of 1972, its amendment, the Clean Water Act of 1977, in the same year as the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970, also referred to as NEPA. We now know a lot more about environmental protection. The sinking of the MV Ferry Adirondack could be used to justify future sinkings. There are no state policies that outline strict parameters around scuttling vessels in Lake Champlain or other Vermont water bodies. I really want to emphasize that point. Shouldn't a policy be drafted subject to public review and put in place before a vessel is purposely sunk? There are more than, and as Laura and Susan both noted, there are more than or around 100 wrecks on the lake bottom. And the Maritime Museum has noted, Susan noted them, that there are 4 sites that could be readily added to the UHP. And I think it would be helpful to hear about those 4 sites and what they offer. So we don't need to sink another boat to create an additional dive site. Second point, public trust. The lake is held in trust by the state for the people. The lake bottom is state property, and therefore the state is responsible for what rests on it and any related environmental consequences, such as toxic contaminants. If the MV Ferry Adirondack causes future environmental impacts, which could be costly, the state would be solely responsible for addressing them. What would it cost to remove part of or the entire vessel from Lake Champlain? Should the Lake Champlain Transportation Company be released of all responsibilities related to the public trust and potential liabilities linked to the MV Ferry Adirondack? Third point, long-term monitoring. The state is responsible for monitoring the vessel long-term, though there are no associated dollars in the state budget for this approach. Therefore, the state should require the non-state applicant to provide financial support for long-term biological, chemical, and physical monitoring. I'm happy to provide more information about this. And there's a 2015 study that's sort of related to this as well. Monitoring is tied to the public trust, especially for a precedent-setting project. We don't want potential adverse impacts to go undiscovered. The state would certainly be responsible for mitigation related to known adverse impacts created by the MV Ferry Adirondack, whether that's next year or 100 years from now. Additionally, our understanding is that the state would be responsible for maintenance of the Ferry Adirondack as the capital bill currently stands. There is no money associated with upkeep of the ferry, and I think that, Laura and Susan have both alluded to this, that more money is needed here. The UHP line item of the bill is dedicated to other sites, not the Ferry Adirondack as it stands now. Fourth point, water quality. There are water quality related concerns associated with the MV Ferry Adirondack, though they will be addressed in other committees. With toxic contaminants, we often learn after the fact that they cause more environmental harm than originally understood. There are current Lake Champlain fish consumption advisories for lake trout and American eel due to polychlorinated biphenyls, that's a mouthful, PCBs. And PCBs are human-made organic chemicals. Until their ban in 1979, PCBs were widely used as coolant fluids for electrical equipment, heat transfer fluids, and in plasticizers and paints, plastics, and rubber products. We see no reason to put Lake Champlain at risk through the sinking of a vessel that contained PCBs, lead, and other contaminants. And LCC believes in the precautionary principle, which states that when there are suspected health or environmental concerns, preventative actions should be taken, even when there is not a scientific certainty that harm will ensue. So in closing, the MV Adirondack is a large steel-hulled, engine-powered vessel. While we understand that there are good faith efforts to remove PCBs and other known contaminants from the boat, we question the wisdom of intentionally sinking such an object into the lake sediments for the rest of time. And while the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, referred to as DEC, does not anticipate there will be adverse impacts, we don't know for sure. Because there is uncertainty, it's an irresponsible precedent to set. Why litter the bottom of Lake Champlain, which the state holds in trust for all people for all time, if we don't need to? Thank you for your time. We appreciate this opportunity, and I welcome any questions you may have. And I would appreciate just speaking to the fish habitat point, which has been brought up multiple times. If possible, may I add clarification on that?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. The Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department's position on the MV Adirondack Artificial Reef Project providing fish habitat is, quote, this project would neither benefit or adversely impact fish and wildlife habitat. The structure would likely attract fish, but not truly be a benefit to fish and wildlife habitat, as Champlain does not lack in habitat, end quote. And that was from a personal communication with Bernie Penka, who is a fisheries biologist, and that has been stated multiple times in our comments. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Senator Ingalls.
So this project, I think, I'm just trying to count through my head, probably went through 4 permits, probably of the strictest departments of the state government, from A&R to the Coast Guard to, I apologize, the other ones are skipping my mind.
Group of engineers.
Yeah, is there any other permit they could get that would make you feel better about this going on? And one other observation I want to make is, I bet that back in the 50s, they probably didn't do all the extensive work that they've done on this boat to ensure as much as their harmful contaminants. I think they probably used to just go out there and sink the boat. From what we've been told, there's been extensive care to make sure that any known harmful particles have been removed. Is that your understanding as well? As long and as well as, is there another permit that would make you change your views?
Thank you for those questions, Senator Ingalls. I believe that one more step needs to take place with the city of Burlington, but I am not aware of the specifics. I do want to mention, in terms of the EPA process, within its language, they state items containing PCBs may be found throughout a ship and are not always easily identifiable or readily accessible. PCBs may be found in a variety of shipboard materials. The location and concentration can vary from item to item and within classes of items. So, you know, I do understand that, and that's a direct quote from the EPA standards. So we understand those good faith efforts, and just want to redirect this conversation and think about it more broadly, because this is a precedent-setting project. And I also want to mention that when LCC thinks about access, we use a broad lens. And so we support projects that reduce barriers to access, such as, you know, the expansion of the UHP via a snorkeling option, which was not spoken about today, but one of the 4 options does include a snorkeling option at the Burlington Barge Canal. And I'm not the expert on this, Susan certainly is, but I do want to raise that there are other options here to create more opportunities for divers, but also folks that don't have the access to diving equipment. Snorkeling is certainly more accessible for, I think, obvious reasons than diving. And
So
would that be wonderful?
You kind of lost me on that a little bit. Are you saying that you would support it on shallower waters so people can snorkel to it versus diving to it,
Sure, I'm mentioning that there are other options entirely for the UHP sites that are already underwater.
You're not talking about this ship.
Correct.
Okay.
Lauren, you had indicated there was another ship, Steelhold, that was sunk up in North Hero, I believe.
South Hero, yes.
South Hero.
I've got that correct. I believe it's South Hero.
Is there any evidence that that ship had PCBs or was somehow environmentally impacting the environment?
I think that would be a great question to defer to Misha, but the vessel was removed. So there was a permit that was granted, and then I guess another permit for it to be removed recently. And I don't know the costs associated with that, but that would be good to know as well. How much did it cost to remove that vessel?
We had heard earlier from Laura that there was a request to sink another vessel, and the answer was no. You've indicated that there's no policy in place. Do you know what surrounded the decision to say no to that previous request?
I don't know. I don't know if that's directed to Laura, but I don't.
Well, I'm hearing on your part a concern that there is an absence of a policy and that this is setting a precedent in the absence of such a policy. And perhaps that's something that needs to be addressed one way or the other, no matter what the decision is about this particular ship.
Yes.
I guess I want to get a clear answer to that first off, if I can turn back to Laura and say, do you know what the decision-making process was in rejecting the previous request?
Yes, we have established criteria. I think there are 8 criteria that you have to meet all of them to be able to intentionally reef, or at least get us to the permitting process for intentionally reefing. And those right now are being adopted as part of the rules for the Division for Historic Preservation.
Is that something you're submitting to LCAR for approval?
Yes, sir, it will be part of that.
LCAR, for the edification of our potential audience, is the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. I'm going back to Lauren now. When the House had this in front of it, the Department of Environmental Conservation had not yet ruled on their application. Since they have and granted a permit, as I understand it, does that change the position that you had from the House, or do you still retain the same position on it?
We retain the same position, and by we, I want to clearly state that this is not only the Lake Champlain Committee, it is also the folks who co-wrote our public comments. So the Vermont Natural Resources Council and Conservation Law Foundation.
Okay. I'm going to try to get them in tomorrow.
Thank you.
Denise, assuming you're still listening, if you could get Lauren, I don't know if you have contact information, but that would be handy for Denise to be able to have.
Absolutely, I'm happy to provide that information.
Okay. Any other questions for Lauren? Seeing nobody else, Misha, I'm going to turn to you. We'll see how far we can get.
All right. I'll try to be quick. So my name is Misha Setner. I work with the Lakes and Ponds program, a part of the DEC. I was the lead technical analyst on this permit application.
That's the Department of Environmental Conservation, DEC?
That's correct. DEC, yes, as a part of the Agency of Natural Resources. So as a part of reviewing this project required a lake encroachment permit as it encroached into public waters. The lake encroachment permit itself, the process to issue a permit, it goes through a public good determination. And it must also be found that the project is consistent with the public trust doctrine. So as a part of the public good determination, DEC needs to determine whether or not the project is excessive for the stated purpose, whether there are less intrusive feasible alternatives, what measures have been taken to reduce impacts on the resource, and then more resource-oriented questions such as how does the project interact with water quality, fish and wildlife habitat, how does the project impact public recreation, navigation, and provided that after that entire review, it can be found that the project does not adversely affect the public good, a permit is issued. And so this project, as Laura identified earlier, how the ship itself is being cleaned through the EPA guidelines for artificial reefing. So through cleaning the vessel through those guidelines, it's been determined that we don't anticipate there will be any adverse impacts on water quality. Lauren identified how she had communications with a Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife fisheries biologist, Bernie Pianka. I worked with him on reviewing this project as well. And overall, Lake Champlain has adequate fish and wildlife habitat. So we don't anticipate that this will add to fish and wildlife habitat, but we don't anticipate that it's going to negatively impact fish and wildlife habitat either. And then in terms of the public recreation side of things, where it's going to be sunk, it's in 68 feet of water when the lake level is at 93.5 feet. Right now, the lake is, I believe, at 96.5 feet. So at that depth, 68 feet of depth, the height of the ship will leave 25 feet of depth between the ship and the surface of the water. So we don't anticipate there to be any impact on navigation. That depth as well it's very beneficial for the public recreation side of things for diving. The upper end of the vessel is accessible to novice divers, and essentially the bowels of the ship are accessible to more advanced divers. So through that balancing act for the public good determination, we were able to confirm that the project does not adversely impact the public good, and that the project is in keeping with the public trust doctrine. And so the permit was issued on March 25th. And so that's the quick rundown.
I get this sense that I might like to have you come back tomorrow in
Okay.
any event, because I want to hear from the other side, so to speak, and have everybody given an opportunity to react to what everybody else is saying. I'd hate to cut this off, and Lauren, that includes you as well. But I'd like to have a full conversation about this before the committee moves off to have its own conversation. I'm going to pause there, ask if the committee has any questions for Misha while we're still here. I don't see anybody raising hands at this stage. My sense is that we probably ought to break here if you folks are able to come back. Misha, especially you, I'd like to be able to have you hearing what the Conservation Law Foundations and VNRC are talking about, and then give a response back. My understanding is that since the permit wasn't issued, I could be wrong on this, but I am assuming you were not asked to testify before the House Committee, or am I wrong?
Yes, I did testify.
You
to the
did,
House.
okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, I'd like to be able to continue the conversation at a point where we can all, I can feel like I'm not forced to rush out the door to get to a court proceeding. Committee, any other questions or thoughts before we break for the afternoon? If not, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I know it's kind of inconvenient to have to come again tomorrow, but hopefully most of you are employed in situations where you like doing this kind of thing. Yes, that could be a joke. With that, thank you all very much for coming. Denise, you can take us off of YouTube. Committee, hang on for just a minute. Thank you. I'm waiting for the light to disappear.